Hello, my name's LifeMaster AJ. I'm coming today to bring you another one in my series of videos. This video will be on one of the greatest games of chess ever played. I have deeply analyzed it on my website, and in the video section, just below the video, there will be a box that says show more, and if you check that box, when this video is posted, I will post the link to my web pages. I'm not going to try to deeply analyze this chess game for the video. I'm just going to restrain my comments to some just general chess playing ideas and kind of give you some color commentary here. But anyway, this is one of the most beautiful games, in my opinion, of chess that was ever played. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and just flip the board around because this game was played by Alekhine, and it's against Efim Bogoljubow, and it was played in Hastings, 1922. And Alekhine himself considered this the prettiest game of chess ever played, and I do believe also it was one of my favorite writers of all time is Irving Chernev, and this was also Irving Chernev's favorite game. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and just briefly, in case you didn't know, Alexander Alekhine is the way you say his name. Some people say Alekhine, but that is incorrect. I believe it's Alekhine. But Alekhine, as we say in English, is generally considered to be one of the greater players that ever lived, and he was world champion back in, I believe, from 27 when he took the title from Alekhine until his death, almost 20 years later. But anyway, the game starts off with d4. This is, of course, common opening, and Alekhine plays the Dutch defense, and that was a favorite of Alekhine. He played it quite a bit. Many years later, they would say this was an unsound opening. But then again, you fast forward to the 1980s, and when I was just a young lad, a bunch of young Russian Turks began resuscitating the Dutch defense. And today you may even see the Dutch played on just about every level. It's extremely popular with amateurs because black plays very aggressively and plays for the center, and often plays for a kingside attack. Just a side personal note here, I used to have a very good friend. His name was Scott Pfeiffer. And when I was just coming up in chess, I mean, I was not a good player yet. Scott Pfeiffer was already probably the best player on the Gulf Coast and easily the best player. He was many times the champion of the Pensacola Chess Club. And he was the best player on the Gulf Coast, and the Dutch opening was one of his favorite openings. So I have many years I've studied this opening. I used to study it with my friend Scott, and I used to watch him play it sometimes. And I was always amazed at how easily he could win. He would start a kingside attack and just, crash through and win against seemingly strong players. And sometimes in his victories, the wins looked deceptively easily. Of course, if you tried to play that way, then, I would come a cropper. I many times tried to imitate Scott's play in the Dutch defense, but he obviously knew the Dutch very well and also had studied it a great deal and had a good feel for the opening. But in the right person's hands, the Dutch can be a dangerous weapon. Anyway, the second move, c4. Knight of 6, g3. G3 is basically an idea that's mostly attributed to Rubinstein. It was played before Rubinstein, but it was really Akiba Rubinstein or Rubinstein who actually turned the fianchetto against the Dutch into a formidable weapon. In fact, Rubinstein all but retired the Dutch defense. He had so many fine victories against it, and a lot of people gave up on the Dutch because of Rubinstein's treatment of the Dutch defense. Anyway, continue on. e6, bishop g2, bishop b4 check. Now today this is okay. I mean, it's not a terrible thing, and black gets a quick check, and if he wants to, he can chop off some wood right away. However, today the move is considered to be less than best, and after the exchange of bishops, black's game is left to be a little bit sterile. It's a little bit too simple. If you're playing against a higher rated player and say you were playing for a draw, then this might be a good way to play. But other than that, I wouldn't really think that this would be a viable opening in today's opening theory. Certainly if I were playing black against another master or an expert, I definitely wouldn't want to play this against a lower rated player and try to win because the position simply becomes too simple. But anyway, bishop b4 check was the move that Alekhine played. Bishop to d2. Today, rather than bishop b4 check, generally the move bishop e7 is considered for bishop to e7, and just castling kingside is considered to be a slightly better way of playing the Dutch. Anyway, white plays bishop to d2. Now, white didn't have to play bishop d2. He could have played knight c3. But then white has the option of doubling black's pawns, and basically black has like a modified version of the Nimzo Indian, maybe with a f5 and a fianchetto of the queen bishop if he can get it in. So maybe that's why Bogoljubow decided not to do that. But also white could play knight d2 there. Bishop d2 is generally considered to be the best move there. Bishop takes d2. Now here, Bogoljubow made a slight inaccuracy. He played a seemingly natural knight recapture here. He played knight takes d2. Later on today, today, with the knowledge that we have today, and because of computers, etc., and opening theory, we know that probably queen takes d2 was a much more accurate move. But Bogoljubow played the seemingly innocent move, the knight recapture here. And the problem is now that for many moves, in fact, for the rest of the game, basically white's two knights seem to be stepping on each other's toes. Black just simply develops knight gf3, black castles, white castles, d6. And here I have to honestly say, at this point, just looking at the game with new eyes, in other words, without any prejudgment of what's happened, I would say that basically white's opening has been a pretty much a success. I mean, white has a very solid position, maybe a slight advantage of space. He controls just a little bit more center than black, and he has almost no developmental problems. However, on the other side of the coin, I also must say that black, does not have a bad bishop, and he can simply play very simply as well, and black has a good game as well. So I'd have to rate this position as very close to equal, although if I had to choose right now, I would say white was for choice simply because he had the fianchetto bishop and he had the better center. But anyway, Bogoljubow considers queen b3, king h8. And now, if I were white, I think I would have to just begin centralizing my rooks and maybe even play rfe1 and go for an instant e4. That might be a very good idea. That's an idea I've used in several of my own games. I beat a player in Mobile a few years ago with that e4 idea and won a game very quickly from a similar position, except I don't think we had exchanged the dark squared bishops. But anyway, here Bogoljubow, it's like he's not quite sure what to do, and his next move is actually logical. He's trying to restrain, he thinks he's restraining black, preventing black from playing his pawn to the e5 square. So he plays queen c3 there. But that's the second move of the queen, so it's a loss of tempo. And now black goes ahead and plays e5 exclam anyway. And it's basically based on a tactic. In other words, after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, if knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, queen takes knight, queen takes d2, and all white has done is managed to chunk a piece. So because of that tactic, which I have to assume that Bogoljubow must have missed, or there was something about this position that he missed, because, black now gets a very good game. I mean, now because of that tactic, because white cannot capture on e5, black's gotten his fair share of the center, and he has a very good game. So now white just continues very simply. He plays e3 there, just guarding the center, central squares. And e4, in a way, white has to be, black has to be cautious of not playing e5, e4 too soon here, as this would just simply leave, black with a bad light squared bishop. In other words, he'd hem his own bishop behind his own pawns, and that's generally always a bad idea. Here, Alekhine shows a very deep positional understanding, and I have to say this about Alekhine. A lot of players said that if they got the positions that Alekhine generally got, then they could make a lot of, or find the same combinations that Alekhine himself found. However, I think the real key to Alekhine's genius was not his ability to make tactics, even though I don't think that's overrated. In fact, if anything, I think it's underrated. Alekhine was an absolute genius for tactics. But I think the other thing that's generally misunderstood by Alekhine was his deep positional understanding. In other words, his ability to take a mundane position like this one and simply continue to build and build and build, and eventually, outplay a very, very strong opponent. And Bogoljubow, for all the criticisms I've heard of Bogoljubow was one of the best players in the world. In fact, if you look at Jeff Sonis' one site, Jeff Sonis' Chess Metrics website, you will see very clearly that at one point Bogoljubow was, rated number 2 in the world. The only person that had a higher rating than him was Alekhine himself. And the other thing, too, is that, Bogoljubow won a lot of tournaments. At one point, he had won, like 10 out of 12 tournaments. He was constantly finishing at or near the top of many chess tournaments all through the late teens, all the way into the 20s and the 30s, right up to the time where he played Alekhine 2 world championship matches. So I don't think Bogoljubow should be underestimated here. I mean, he was a very good player. And to be able to outplay a strong player like Bogoljubow, a grandmaster, a player who obviously understood chess, from a fairly mundane and rather seemingly equal position like the one we have before us now really speaks much to me of Alekhine's talent and his understanding of chess. But anyway, the main idea of A5 to me is that here, white, if you wanted to, let's just backtrack one move. Let's say black just did a weak move like H6, which would be very bad because knight H4 might threaten a knight fork on the G6 square. But let's just say H6, if he wanted to, he could play moves like B4, B5, and just generally expand in space on the queen side. And you have to remember your four basic elements in chess are basically space, time, force, and material. Those are only the four elements. Those are the only four elements of chess. If someone tells you differently, then they're simply wrong. But space is basically the idea of squares on the chessboard. Time is very simple, the idea of you move, I move, and we take turns moving. And the idea of time is built into every board game practically ever invented by man. The idea of force is very simply defined, would be any time a piece exerts capturing power on a square. I think that and that alone is the most simplest and the most, therefore, elegant by its simplicity, but that is the simplest and easiest definition of force. And then the last one is not too commonly understood. And, all the other guys who say all other things are elements like king safety, like pawn structure, like I could just go on and on and on about other grandmasters and even the Russian school of chess that considers other things to be elements of chess. An element is by definition something that's always present. In other words, you can't erase it. It's always there, and it's in one form or another, and it's native to the game of chess. So if you say something like pawn structure is an element of chess, I can show you there's lots of positions where all the pawns have been captured. So therefore, by simple logic, pawn structure cannot be an element of chess because you could never introduce a position where one of the elements did not exist. So basically, the last final element is material, and the best way I know to express what material is, well, the way I define material, and this was a definition that was crafted by an English person, a lady that taught English here at the local Pensacola Junior College back before it changed name and became a state college. But she was a teacher at PJC in English, and she helped me craft the definition of material as being the resonant potential energy contained within the pieces as defined by the table of material value. Having said that, I mean, that's very difficult to understand, and I guess you have to be an English major to understand that one. Simply put, to me, the way I understand it is basically every piece is a battery. It has energy stored inside of it, and it will only release that energy once you place the piece on its best square. And to me, that's basically the understanding of what material value really is all about. I mean, it's about that idea about each piece yearning to break free, each piece yearning to do its most damage, each piece trying to reach that position of maximum opportunity where it can release its energy upon the chessboard. So anyway, having said that, so we have four elements here. And since space is one of the elements, then you have to be cognizant of the fact that you simply can't ignore an element like space. For example, I can show you several of my own games where I simply forgot about space, and say a stronger player like a master or even a lower rated player simply took away all the squares, began expanding in space, and eventually I found myself in a dead loss position simply because I ignored one of the basic elements of chess. So all I'm trying to tell to you is that space is a basic element of chess, and if you ignore that, you do so at your own peril. So here basically what Alekhine's next move is he plays A5, and what that does is it captures a good deal of space there on the queen side and also prevents white from expanding on the queen side with the ideas of like B2, B4. White continues just B3. I mean, he's just trying to keep a nice clean pawn structure. Now black plays queen E8. This is a very simple move, a very strong move, but a very simple move, and I give that an exclam, and a lot of others do too. It's a very common idea. If you've ever studied, multiple games with the Dutch defense, you'll see the idea of black playing queen E8, queen H5, and starting a kingside assault. I mean, there's just dozens and dozens of games where that idea had already been featured, that's been played before or since. So that's a very common Dutch defense idea. Of course, this was played, back in 1922, so there hadn't been that many Dutches played back then, but already Alekhine knew the basic ideas of the Dutch. And basically, because black has this pawn on F5, then if the queen comes to E8, it has easy access to the king side, and that's why black can start an attack. In fact, it's why this g3 is one of the better lines against the Dutch, is because many times in the Dutch, before he exchange the dark squared bishop, if he plays queen e8, queen h5, and if there's a bishop sitting on d6 or c7, as I've done in some of my own games, black can get a terrific kingside attack. And that's the whole purpose of Rubinstein's idea of this fianchetto, this wedge of pawns here, is to help blunt the effect of some of black's pieces if he tries that idea of pointing all of his pieces at the white king side. So anyway, black plays queen e8. Again, the idea is simply to slide the queen up to g6 or h5 and start some nice piece activity there. White plays a3. That's probably a good move. It keeps this black knight off the b4 square, and he's still looking at ideas of b2, b4 there. White goes ahead and plays queen h5. Again, the most accurate move. Some people had said there are other moves there that Alekhine could play, but that's the most forceful move. And he begins a demonstration now on the king side. And he's basically threatened to attack, and I don't think there was any player who ever played Alekhine that wasn't aware of what a great tactician he was, and probably wasn't just a little bit afraid of some of his tactics. So I think there's a psychological element to chess. I think many times it's overlooked. Only players like Tao and really Lasker seem to genuinely know and understand the full range of what kind of ideas you could have that were expressed in psychological terms, and seem to take advantage, consciously try to take advantage of the psychological nature of chess. And I think that move is both a strong move on the chessboard, but it's also a strong move psychologically. In other words, you're basically saying to your opponent, knock, knock on the door, here I come, I'm starting an attack, what are you going to do about it? And so I think that's basically what Alekhine's doing here, and it might even intimidate Bogoljubow just a little bit. So white now plays h4, and I think that move in the long run has to be viewed as a weakening of white's king side. Sooner or later, that he's going to regret that. According to the computer, the correct continuation, rather than h4, was d takes e5, knight takes e5, and then white plays knight d4. This releases the bishop on the long diagonal, and now white can play moves like b4 and all the way, even run these pawns down, or play a rook to b1 and play b4 it takes here and try to exert pressure on this b7 square. Meantime, if white plays something, black rather plays some move like either knight to g4, then simply h3 will drive away the knight. So that was the best, and that was found with the computers, but that would probably be a better idea than h4. h4 is nice because white doesn't have to worry about his h2 square being attacked anymore, but the severe drawback is that this g4 square has been severely weakened. For example, if black sticks a knight on that square, there's no h3 to drive the knight away. And also, too, moves like f5, f4 are going to cause the total destruction, the collapse of the whole pawn chain that it's in front of the white king, and that could lead to a strong kingside attack. Black immediately puts a knight on g4, exploiting the newfound weakness on g4, and the fact that there's no h3 to drive the knight away. Black responds in kind. He plays knight g5. Alekhine simply plays bishop d7. I will say this for the 15 moves, and in my opinion, Alekhine has played the opening perfectly. He has almost no weaknesses on his sides of the board. He's not made any wasted or any bad moves. He's not created any pawn weaknesses that his opponent can exploit, while the same cannot be said of Bogoljubow's position. Here white plays f3. Now, the f3 was a very committal move there. Black can't just grab the pawn because obviously the queen controls the e3 square. But the problem with this move is now he's tinkered with his king side a little too much. And I think he does have an idea. In fact, I think it becomes very obvious that white's strategy is simply to drive black's knights away, and also then to lock up the position. In other words, he's going to try to close the position down and lock Alekhine's pieces out in a vain attempt to try to limit black's tactical opportunities. But anyway, obviously the obvious drawback to a move like f3 is that it grossly weakens the king side, and basically Alekhine's eventually going to take full advantage of that. And you'll see in the final phase of the game that Alekhine does indeed take advantage of Bogoljubow's lapses and choose him up on the king side. But there's still a lot of play before that happens. Knight f6, of course, the knight retreats. f4. Now, what this is that basically he's saying, well, yeah, I kicked the knight. The knight could go back here, but now he might take here and get a degree of freedom for his pieces. But the big thing is that the knight goes here, but where does he go from there? How does black rather go about getting in? And the idea of f4 is trying to create a total, blockade. And Alekhine goes along with him. He plays e4. Now, yes, he now has a bad bishop, but White's bishop now has been completely shut out of the game. And the only pawn break available to White is the idea of g3, g4, which I think is probably just too risky. So basically now, he's, Black's just playing now just to bottle White up and just totally shut him down and basically not allow White's pieces any room to maneuver at all. The next few moves look to be best, for both sides. White plays rook d1, just getting rooks to the center. Black plays h6, he kicks that knight off. And notice too that now because the knight doesn't have the f3 square anymore because of his pawn on e4, that basically White, Bogoljubow is forced to sideline his knight. In other words, the knight is forced to go back to h3 because that's the only square that it's not totally lost. Now Alekhine breaks in the center. He plays d5. Again, it's all about getting lines for his pieces and getting more room on the chessboard. I think maybe that here Bogoljubow should have considered maybe pawn takes pawn, and even because that would open the c file for him. And then later you can play bishop f1 and knight f2. I think White has ideas there to rearrange his pieces, but he never tries any of that. He simply plays again somewhat passively knight f1. Black plays knight e7. He's just playing to rearrange his pieces. White plays a4. Notice again the idea is he's trying to just totally bottle up the position. I think he's going to try to draw simply by making a totally blockaded position, or at least that seems to be his strategy. Now the knight goes back to c6. The reason being is the reason the knight left c6 was Black before a4. Black was thinking about maybe playing moves like c5 and b5. But now once White plays a4, now Black says he sees that his knight can take over this b4 square. So the knight goes back to c2. White plays rook d2, knight b4 as advertised. Bishop h1, that's just a move because White doesn't have a lot of better moves. Queen e8, exclam. After seemingly, putting all of his energy to defend or to attacking the king side, suddenly the Black queen abandons the king side. And I think that Bogoljubow had done such a good job of blocking up the position and also making sure his pieces laterally could get back to the king side that basically Alekhine decided that his future wasn't on the king side but on the queen side. And I think that takes a certain amount of good positional understanding to really make that decision and make it correctly. White plays rook g2. I think actually Bogoljubow is thinking about starting his own attack there on the king side, maybe playing g4 and going for an all-out attack on the king side. Maybe he should have done that too. Maybe the idea of knight h2 and then g4, knight f2 rather, and then g4, and then start his own attack, put his king here and double his rooks on the g file. Almost any activity would have been preferable, I think, to the course of the game. The way the game winds up going is eventually, Bogoljubow winds up in a position where he has almost zero play. His pieces just sit on odd squares, and Alekhine basically just dances on his head. So I think any plan would have been better or preferable to what eventually happens in this game. Rook d takes c4, b takes c4. Bishop takes a4. Of course, there, he's winning a pawn. It's only temporarily. White can get the pawn back if he wants to. Knight f2, bishop back to d7, knight to d2, and now Black plays b5. He's not trying to just win a pawn and cash in on it. Basically, Black's, he's trying to blow open as many lines for his pieces, seeing that basically White's pieces don't have a high degree. In other words, here's the logic. Both sides have pieces on the board, but because White's knights are on these two odd squares, d2 and f2, this rook on g2, blocking in the bishop on h1, the bishop on h1 basically bites on granite on e4. Basically, I think Alekhine's logic is my pieces have much more freedom and scope and many more natural open lines than White's do. And if the position gets open wide open, then I'm going to have much more play than my opponent. And I think that's 100% correct. So b5. Obviously, Bogoljubow, he declines here to continue to open the position. He plays for a closed position. Black plays knight d3. Alekhine plays knight d3. He's going for the outpost on the d3 square. Black plays rook takes a5. Maybe should have left that pawn alone. Okay. And actually, I want to go back here after knight d3 here. It's very, very obvious to anyone who's ever studied chess that White has been completely outplayed. Forget about the reasons for the individual move. When taken as a whole, White has basically been outplayed. His game strategy is a bust. Black's got a knight on d3. His pieces are much better coordinated. He's a pawn up, and I think when you add it all up together, basically it's very clear that white has been outplayed. And, this is also, too, the beginning of one of the greatest combinations in the annals of chess. White plays rook takes a5. Again, maybe he should have forgot about that pawn and done something else. I'd really have to get into deep Fritz analysis to show you that, but that's really not necessary. That's not the point of this video. Black plays b4. Again, protected by the knight, just kicking the queen. Rook takes a8. And now here's where, obviously at this point, Bogoljubow must have been expecting simply queen takes a8. And this is where the fireworks start. And this is where Fritz says queen a1 here was much better for white, but the black is obviously still winning. I mean, that's, if you don't believe me, you can fire up any chess engine and just check that for yourself. But here, white plays rook takes a8, obviously expecting Alekhine to recapture on a8 with his queen, but Alekhine doesn't oblige. He plays b takes c3 double exclam. That is just a really brilliant move. Maybe a triple exclam, a once-in-a-lifetime move. Of course, Bogoljubow, he takes black's queen. Rook takes queen. That's a natural move there. Trying to save your rook, get your rook, and thinking again that he's going to recapture rook takes rook. In fact, after rook takes rook and knight takes c3, white might be okay there. He might have actually a playable position. But Alekhine doesn't oblige once more. And if you want to, you can try to pause the video here. I'll stop speaking here in a second, but when I stop speaking, pause the video and just see if you can guess what black's next move is. Okay, if you did like I asked and paused the video, you know that basically that what you tried to guess the next move, and here again it's not the mundane recapture of the rook, it's c2 double exclam. One of the most amazing and brilliant moves of any century. I don't care how you slice it. Stunning, spectacular. I mean, you run out of adjectives trying to describe this move. It's just really brilliant, and one can see why Alekhine thought maybe this was probably one of the best games of chess that he had ever played. It's certainly an amazing chess combination, far beyond anything I've ever been able to pull off on the chessboard. And he pulled it off not just against a rank amateur, but against Bogoljubow, who at that time was probably one of the best players in the world. So anyway, c2, the idea being, again, I think the tactic is fairly well known. Problem composers use this idea a lot. A pawn advancing, hitting a knight on the first row, and the knight not being able to flee, and then a pawn either promotes or will either capture or promote with a new queen. So that's the idea there. But it's in a very unusual circumstances. But anyway, this is really an amazing combination, this idea of c2, the idea of advancing the pawn, hitting the knight on d1, the knight on d1's attack, and that's, basically that now no matter what white does, black is going to win more material. And naturally he plays rook takes f8 check, king up, but he can't save the knight, or he can't prevent black, rather, from promoting to a new queen. He can save the knight, but that doesn't stop him from promoting there. Queen check. Knight f1, he has to play that. If he just gives up if he routinely gives up pieces, obviously he's going to be lost. And now knight e1, another nice move. In fact, the threat here is very brutal. He just knight f3, smothered mate. The king will be mated there. So that's just an amazing move now. And white tries to defend. Rook h2. He's got to create a defense of this square, give his king a square, or create a defense of the f3 square. Queen takes c4. The computer, I'll just mention in passing, the computer prefers 35 knight c2 here. And that's Fritz, Houdini, and also Ripka and Deep Shredder. I think they all agree that 35 knight c2 is the best move. I kind of like Alekhine's move. I mean, grabbing the pawn is very simple and very, very, very good. Rook b8, bishop b5. Now there's the threat of queen takes knight on f1 check. So he decides rook takes b5 is forced. Queen takes b5. g4, again, just trying to get some play for his pieces. I mean, it looks like you could, if you're a beginner, you could look at this position and say it's dead loss, but an experienced player would know that white still has quite a number of pieces on the chessboard, and even though it's a bishop and a rook for a queen, there's not that many pawns left, and basically if white continues his strategy of just changing as many pawns as he can, and also exchanging off both sets of knights, if it ever gets down to a reduced position of reduced material with only one or two pawns on, and just the bishop and rook versus the lone black queen, it can be a very difficult win indeed. So obviously what black has to do is avoid a lot of the unnecessary exchanges and reaching that type of position in the first place. In other words, he's constantly got to be looking for in-between moves and pressure and those type of things. So knight f3 check. That's going to force him to take with the bishop. Takes. Black has another pawn, and it's near the king. He plays g takes f5. I might have played g5 there. Maybe that was a slightly better move. But g takes f5. Queen e2. Once more, basically now white's in a position of almost zugzwang. He can't hardly move anything. And, white's just completely tied up here. So he plays d5, king g8, just swinging the king around, h5, king h7. Now e4, simply because white doesn't have a lot of moves. I mean, for example, if he plays knight e3, then knight g3 rather, he drops the pawn on e3. So white, basically now is forced to play giveaway because in a state of almost total zugzwang, he can't hardly move his pieces without dropping material. E4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, queen takes e4, d6, c takes d6, f6, g takes f6. Basically, white's just trying to give away pawns, but he's doing so with a plan. I mean, if he can give away, if he can give away one or two pawns, get some room for his pieces, and then win this pawn here and keep one or two pawns on the board, again, we're reaching one of those reduced positions, and now black has just his queen. And if it ever gets down to a rook and knight versus just a queen, then that's a dead draw. I mean, if white can, it's unlikely that white from this position would be able to do that, but the white's general drawing strategy from this position should correctly be trade off all the pawns and get down to an endgame of just knight and rook versus a lone queen. And if that endgame is ever reached, then I can tell you indeed that is a draw, except for some very special cases. But obviously, Alekhine's job is to make sure that that never happens. White plays rook d2, trying to get his rook active. And now we have another beautiful move by Alekhine. Yet another queen sacrifice. Queen e2, exclam. Cutting off there, and if the rook takes the pawn, if white plays rook takes d6, then simply queen g2 mate. And so, Bogoljubow sees no choice but to take. Rook takes e2, f takes e2. And once more, another repetitive theme. We have seen this several times in this game. This theme has repeated itself. We see a pawn on the 7th rank, black 7th rank, attacking a white knight on the first row. And, once more, the black's, white's going to be guaranteed. In other words, if he moves the knight away, we just promote a pawn. King f2 is forced, otherwise, it makes a queen, but now we get e takes f1 check. Oh, backing up here, too. Just wanted to mention that I like queen e2. Queen e2 is a very nice move. Fritz 13, it likes queen takes pawn and f4 there. That's obviously probably a win, too, simply by material. And, he can run. I found the idea later of running the king all the way around and even leaving the black queen on f4, run the black king rather all the way around. In other words, g7, f7, e6, f5, g4, and take this pawn. And I actually was able to do that. And, if that's ever happens, then basically it's just an easy win for black. It's sort of material. But I like Alekhine's move. It's very elegant. It just queen e2, and again, takes, and now we're just paring down. It's the Capablanca idea. Capablanca's fundamental idea or principle when he was approaching the endgame is if he had a one game, just keep exchanging down to whatever the simplest win is. I don't remember which game it was of Capablanca's that I saw this, but I remember one time Capablanca had a game and his opponent had many, many threats. And what Kappa did was he had many different ways to win, and the computer doesn't win the way that Kappa does. But Kappa found the very simple idea of just trading down to an even king and pawn ending. But in the king and pawn ending, the white king in that game had two sets of double pawns and had a rotten pawn structure, and also his king was all the way back on like the second row, whereas black's king penetrated to the 5th or 6th row. It was a very simple win for black. So basically what Capablanca did was took a position, reduced it to a dead even, but a very simply one king and pawn ending. In other words, always reduce things. I think that the best way to describe that Capablanca principle is that when you have a superior or one position, don't be afraid to exchange material or even give back some of the material if you can reach an easily won position, especially one where your opponent has very little or no counterplay. So anyway, f takes e2, king f2, that was forced to stop black from promoting to a queen. E takes f1 queen, king takes, king g7. Now it's just a simple one king and pawn ending. King e2, king f7, king e3, king e6, king e4, d5 check. And at this point, Bogoljubow resigned. He doesn't want to see a fourth queen in this game. In other words, eventually black will win all white's pawns and advance down and make another queen. And it's a very simple king and pawn ending. If you want to analyze it further, you can knock yourself out. I'm not going to bother. All you have to do is turn on any engine, and you'll see basically black's already ahead one pawn. And if the white king goes to d4, black can simply play king f5 and take both the white pawns. King takes f4, king g5, king takes there, and eat all of white's pawns, and then eventually push a pawn in and make a queen. So anyway, here this is where Bogoljubow resigned. It's very clearly a lost position, and it's a game where I think that basically black played with unparalleled brilliance, and he played on both sides of the chessboard. And Alekhine himself considered this to be his greatest game of chess ever played. And I think it is brilliant beyond all of my ability to describe it. Yes, Bogoljubow was reduced to a position where he had his pieces on horrible squares, but I don't think that's a knock on Bogoljubow. I think that's part of the genius of Alekhine, the little understood of how Alekhine was simply able to find moves, reasonable moves, sometimes simple-looking moves, but eventually took a player like Bogoljubow, who I can show you many of Bogoljubow's best games, and if you just want to look for some of the games that I've annotated on the internet, I'm sure you'll find a few that are annotated by me that Bogoljubow won very brilliantly. But anyway, he was just a brilliant player, and he could play very brilliantly and beat a lot of players. And just the simple fact that Alekhine outplayed him so strongly and pushed him into a position where all his pieces were on bad squares, I think is more of a credit to Alekhine than it is a criticism of Bogoljubow. It just shows you what a deep understanding that Alekhine had of chess. And I think it's a little understood facet of Alekhine's play was his deep understanding of chess. And I think he also had a native understanding of one of the previous world champions, the second world champion, Emanuel Lasker, who often said he was a student of psychology in chess. And very often to me, his moves speak volumes to me today about the psychology of some of his moves. And I think Alekhine also understood this as well. Hopefully I've touched on all these different ideas. I hope you enjoyed my commentary of this game. Again, I haven't tried to really analyze this game. This has been more of a color commentary, sort of a blow-by-blow of the game and describing the game. If you're looking for a deep analysis of this game, I do have that already posted on the internet. Just if you need trouble finding it, either see the Show More section of the video or just simply Google it, and you will find my annotations of this game. I have several web pages where I've analyzed this game. I just posted a new one just about less than a week ago. And again, that was just updated. That was done with all the latest computers and the latest opening books and all that good stuff. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed my video. I hope you enjoyed my explanation and my commentary of this game. If you enjoy my videos enough to consider making a contribution supporting my efforts of both making great chess videos and also making web pages for the internet for your enjoyment, it's all free. You never have to pay anything. But if you would like to support my efforts, please go to the PayPal website. That's www.paypal.com and make a contribution using my email, which is lifemasteraj@yahoo.com. And I thank you for watching this video. Thank you for watching all of my videos, and appreciate you being a fan of chess. I hope you'll watch more of my videos, and have a great day.